Hey team, and welcome to another video in the Astrological Magical Elections video series. In this video, we're going to do something a little bit different. While normally this would be the time that we would talk about magical elections that are going to be available to us during the Libra full moon period and the waning moon period, there really aren't any electionals to really talk about. So instead, I thought we would talk about Saturn and his transit through Aquarius, really kind of scrutinizing that whole time period and looking and focusing on electional opportunities that are going to be available for us so that we can plan ahead. Of course, Saturn will be in the sign of Aquarius from March 22nd, 2020 until March 7th of 2023, aside from a small period of time between July and December of 2020 where he will dip back into Capricorn. So we're going to kind of take some time and explore Saturn's transit, identify good periods and bad periods of time when we won't look at elections at all. And as we go through, we'll stop and take a look at some of the good elections that I found. We'll kind of recap at the end. And this might be something of a series that I do to just really take a second to look at planets as they ingress into their signs of exaltation and domicile for a little bit of kind of future planning for any astrological opportunities that might be available, or talk about why there aren't going to be any for one reason or another. So here, as you can see, this chart is set for March 22nd, 2020, and you can see Saturn here at 0 degrees of Aquarius, and this is the Saturn ingress into the sign of Aquarius. And really kind of the difficult part about this first kind of section, we'll say, the kind of first month of Saturn in Aquarius is going to be Mars is applying conjunction to Saturn. It's going to mess it up, just having that secondary malefic influence. So as we kind of move forward in time here, we'll see Mars move forward, catch up to Saturn, and then pass him. And we'll really have our first opportunity for a Saturn election on April 15th at around 2:58 a.m. my time, so make sure to set that. But what you're really looking for during this time is, of course, Saturn's being in his sign of domicile Aquarius, with Aquarius rising, and the moon applying a conjunction to Saturn in Aquarius. Those are kind of like your main points. For me here at this time, it's the hour of Saturn. It'll be a Tuesday night. Well, technically, I guess a Wednesday night before sunrise. So a Tuesday night, astrologically speaking, but it will be the hour of Saturn, and you want to make sure that you have that Saturn hour if this is a chart that you decide to move forward with. So kind of the good points of this chart here is that we do have the moon applying the conjunction to Saturn very closely, and you want to be careful also working with this election if you live a little bit more west of me to make sure that the moon actually hasn't separated from Saturn at this point, is actually applying to Mars. So if you miss that moon separate, or if you miss that moon application to Saturn, then you're not going to have this talisman as an opportunity, actually. But kind of moving on, some of the good points about this election, you have this conjunction here in the first house. That's always really good. And then you also have kind of loosely this Venus trine from Gemini, kind of helping to bring a bit more stability and more peacefulness to it. Another really good point to consider is that Saturn, being well placed in its domicile, is the domicile lord of the moon, and that tends to be like an important tertiary consideration. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of tertiary and secondary considerations about charts and about electional charts when we kind of move into the review part, where we really kind of take the charts and kind of compare and contrast them with one another and say, oh, this is good for this one, and these, just kind of rank them and talk about why those ranks are that way. So we'll talk more about that towards the end. But we do have Saturn as the moon's lord. The bad point that we're kind of always going to have during this time period where when you have, Mars in Aquarius as well, is that because Mars is in that same sign, and even, the beginning parts of Pisces, depending on your location or what house system that you use, Mars will be in the first house, which is going to be kind of a more difficult placement, and it might be something that many astrologers choose to avoid entirely, which is totally fine. I probably would most of the time as well. You don't usually want Mars in the first house unless you're incorporating that somehow into it because of Mars's malevolence and just kind of extreme attitude. It's difficult to work with. Kind of another downside of this chart, again, kind of one of those tertiary considerations, is that the moon is moving slowly. You typically want the moon to move more quickly because it helps with the manifestation aspect of it. Things happen more quickly with the talisman or around the talisman or regarding the talisman. It's just a little bit easier, a little bit faster. You get a bit more response to it. I also kind of want to take a quick second to talk more about this Mars and Saturn conjunction. Because, in the first part, I mentioned that it was bad, and now I have a chart with Mars and Saturn conjoined, and now I'm saying that that's fine. And this is kind of going to depend on a little bit on how you feel about aspects themselves. Myself, being more of a medievalist, I tend to follow the rules of orbs of moiety, where you add the moiety of two planets together, and that number tells you how large of an aspect of two planets can have. With Mars and Saturn, it's 8.5 degrees. So once Mars and Saturn get past 8.5 degrees apart, I think that they're okay. But there are, always follow what you've always done. Don't change your preferences based on me or or, really when anybody tells you, make sure that, what you're using makes sense to you and it's something that you can kind of logically explain to somebody else. So for people who use tighter orbs more generally, or, are okay with using moiety, just having that, the more than like 5 degrees or 8 degrees is fine. But there are also, some astrologers who prefer to use whole sign aspects. And so in that case, these two planets are going to be co-present and conjoined, all throughout their stay in Aquarius, regardless of how far apart they get. So just something to keep in mind if you, use more of those whole sign aspects, then keep doing that. Don't let me change your mind. Whereas if you use tighter orbs, just kind of use what you've always used and your practice will be fine. So just kind of moving forward in time day by day, we're going to see Mars separate from Saturn further and further, giving us a bit more breathing room when it comes to talismanic collections there. He'll, of course, be in Aquarius for a little bit, so those of us who use whole sign aspects are still going to have to struggle with that. But our next Saturn electional opportunity is actually going to be from May the 4th. We're kind of focusing on that same configuration. For me, this is around 1:45 a.m. And here what we're focusing on is, again, Saturn in Aquarius on the ascendant. Those kind of we're either going to see Saturn here or we're going to see Saturn here on the midheaven. Like, that's not going to be a surprise. Aquarius on the ascendant, with Saturn being Lord of the first house, giving us another thing to not really have to worry about. And here we're focused instead on the moon's applying trine to Saturn. Right now she's placed in Virgo, but of course she's applying the trine within 2 degrees, and she'll have ingressed into Libra to complete that trine. So really great connection there that we really want to have, especially when we can take it. This chart is set for a sun's day, but it's Saturn's hour, so you always want to have one or the other, preferably, both in the ideal, but one or the other, always. The moon is moving quickly in this chart, as opposed to the last one where she was moving slowly, but her dispositor Mercury, is placed in the 3rd house, which isn't super terrible, but is super, super combust to the sun with like less than 3/4 of a degree distance. So that might be a problem to take into consideration if you're, weighing this chart about with other ones that we're going to talk about. And also, of course, since Mars is still in Aquarius, we still have Mars's presence in the 1st house. So also at this point, Saturn is moving pretty slowly at about 2 minutes a day. That's kind of roughly his average, but he's moving a little bit slower than his average. That's something also to take into consideration, because what's about to happen is the closer the sun gets to the trine of Saturn, the slower Saturn will move, because Saturn is about to station retrograde, which is something that will happen just a few days later on May 11th. Now we have Saturn retrograde. And so all from May 11th until around September 29th, Saturn will be retrograde. I mean, you cannot use Saturnine talismans when Saturn is retrograde. So, basically the whole summer into early autumn is just completely blank for Saturn talismans. We're just going to kind of jump through there. From July 2nd until December 17th, Saturn will pop back into Capricorn. And we can kind of talk about that a little bit. Saturn will be retrograde, as you can see, up until September. And here we have Saturn at the direct station, and so Saturn will station direct on September 29th, and so, following the retrograde and then being back into Capricorn, you might think, oh, this is a good time to try for Saturn and Capricorn talismans again, but it's actually really not a good time, because what happens is Saturn will station retrograde almost exactly square to Mars in Aries, who is also retrograde. And, that's not good. We can't use that. And Mars will be within a square to Saturn until around October 30th. So, we go basically from May until November without having really any good Saturn talismanic opportunities at all to work with. So let's go ahead and kind of take a look at what that looks like. Moving forward a month, we'll have Saturn at 26 degrees Capricorn and Mars at 16 degrees Aries, so we have a 10-degree difference, a really very comfortable difference to work with here. And so we really don't have any good lineups or any good configurations for Saturnine talismans until December 21st, 2020, and that is actually kind of special, and I'm kind of really excited about that. So let's look at what that looks like moving forward to November here, and then moving into December. Saturn moves back into Aquarius on December 17th, and then on December 21st, we'll have the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction, and yes, we will actually be able to have like a talismanic configuration for that in a way that's actually kind of neat. So kind of moving this forward here, while I don't necessarily recommend using this for like a Saturn-specific talisman, I don't think there's really any way you'll be able to do something like explicitly Saturnine with this, because there is the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction together very, very, very close. I think it would be a really interesting talismanic opportunity to pursue for those who want to give it a shot. So this is kind of what the chart would look like. So our opportunity for this election is going to be around 3:30 p.m. my time, and here, of course, we'll have the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction really close, like right on the midheaven, which is really neat. And you'll have a moon in Pisces applying a sextile to that, because she'll, of course, ingress into the sign of Aries in about 2 degrees. Ow. So as I was saying, I don't think this election would make, a really great Saturn talisman per se, because we do have that Jupiter conjunction caught up very closely in it. But the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction is actually a very special time. In traditional astrology, especially in the mundane branch, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions sort of neatly divide the world into like these chapters of history, to where the conjunctions kind of mark the transition points into different ages, or like to different epochs, or just like different societal shifts that happen around those times. And kind of as you look back in the past, you'll see that since we started kind of dividing people up into generations, like millennials and Gen Z and boomers and things like that, Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions coincide very closely to a lot of these kind of date ranges that sociologists use to distinguish one generation from the next. So a really kind of interesting way that classical mundane ideas have become kind of ingrained into pop culture today. So I think it's really special that we have a really great opportunity to make a talisman of that conjunction. So diving into the election a little bit more closely, of course, we do have the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction on the midheaven, like I was talking about, as well as the moon applying the sextile with Pisces. It's the moon's day and Saturn's hour for my location. Make sure that it's the Saturn's hour if you want to move forward with this. I think it's important for the for the time to be of at least one of the planets in the conjunction. So either the Jupiter hour or the Saturn hour. And Lord of the first house, of course, we have Taurus rising. It's going to be Venus here in Sagittarius. Kind of conjoin the cusp of the 8th house, which is it's okay. It's not too terrible, but it's not great. But she's not afflicted by Saturn, of course. That's the planet that we're working with, and she's in a really loose trine to Mars, so she's unafflicted by any of those planets, which is good. We don't want that to happen. So I just think this is a really fascinating election. I was really excited when I found it, and I think that as we kind of get closer to the time period, we'll see ways in which we can use this chart and this election a little bit better, even on like a very simple basis. I think that this election could be a great talisman for a Saturn talisman that's a bit more tempered with the Jupiter presence than a Saturn talisman would normally. So if somebody is, interested in working with Saturn purely, this probably isn't a good chart for that. But for somebody who maybe has a more difficult relationship with Saturn in their natal chart, this might be a really great kind of like first step way to like introduce yourself to a planet that is more traditionally known for being difficult. So something to consider as far as that goes. Our next electional opportunity is actually just a few days later. Here, just the day after Christmas, December 26th, we still have this strong Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And it's very similar to the previous election in that we're kind of keeping the same ideas. We have the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction on the midheaven. We have the same ascendant Taurus with Venus placed in the 7th house here. Again, not afflicted by Saturn or Mars. That's really great. And now what's really changed is that the moon has moved into Taurus, a sign that she does well in, and will be applying a trine to Saturn as she moves forward into Gemini. So really strong connection there. Not only is Saturn well placed in this chart, but the moon is well placed. They're both angular planets. They're both in signs that they do well in. This could be a really great chart. The moon is also moving quickly in this chart if that's a concern of yours that you have. And everything is kind of situated really well. There's also a Saturn-Jupiter rising option in this one. So if you want to set the time back to where these two planets are instead rising together, you'll have, the Aquarius ascendant with Saturn now in the 1st house. So your Lord of the First is a little bit more well protected. And here we have the moon now in the 4th house, still angular, still in a sign she does well in, applying the trine to Saturn there. So either of these options is fine. This one is during Saturn's day, they're both during Saturn's day. So not something to have to worry about so far as timing. It'll be a Saturday. So after having a couple of electional opportunities kind of back to back, we'll move into a little bit of a dry spell with Saturn talismans. As we move forward to around December 28th, we'll get the Mars-Saturn square really cementing. And of course, at that point, because Mars and Saturn will be square, Saturn will be afflicted by Mars, and we can't use Saturn during the period of time that the Mars square is intensified. So we'll move forward in time past through that. So as we have the Mars-Saturn square intensifying, around the same time we'll have the Sun moving close enough to Saturn to render him within the beams and then combust. And obviously we can't use a Saturn that's afflicted to such a degree. And that whole being within the beams and the combustion phase of the Saturn synodic cycle will occur between January 7th and February 9th, with the Mars square finally separating out of orb around February 3rd. So we'll be finished up with both of those kind of difficult Saturn configurations at roughly the same time. The Cazimi period for Saturn will be January 23rd, and usually the Cazimi periods are good times for, cleaning Saturn altars, purchasing new Saturnine tools, and doing kind of like a cleansing ritual for any kind of long-standing Saturnine talismans that you have. So if you made any Saturn talismans, for the elections that came before this would be a good time to, renew them, to clean them off, even though they probably aren't that dirty, just to kind of get into the habit of doing that ritual every year. So something to keep in mind for this date, if you've done that. This Cazimi period itself, it can be a good time to ritually make a talisman, but it won't be for the Saturn talisman, because at the height of the Cazimi, the Mars-Saturn square will still be into effect. So you can't use this time period for a Saturn talisman without carrying in the kind of damaging Mars affliction at the same time. Moving a little bit further in time, we're going to go ahead and skip on to our next Saturnine talismanic election, and that is going to be in April 25th, 2021 to be exact. And that chart is going to be set for Saturn rise here around 3 a.m. My time is kind of what you're going to look for. And here we're going to have Saturn in the first house rising in Aquarius, with Saturn as lord of the first house, the moon applying a trine in Libra to Saturn. A really great configuration to start off with. Also Jupiter placed in the first house, a much better first house placement than, say, Mars, as we had in the original or in some of the earlier electional charts that we shared. The moon is fast in this chart, and her dispositor Venus is in her own sign of Taurus, within the beams, which is a little uncomfortable, but very well dignified in her own domicile, so that's positive as well. One thing to kind of be on the lookout for with this election is that the moon is separating a square to Saturn with about 8 degrees. That's a pretty wide amount, pretty easily separable, but just something to keep in mind that's kind of hanging on or lingering on in the election chart itself. Otherwise, this is occurring on the day of Saturn and is a really, really well-constructed electional chart. I think this is probably my favorite in the ones that I have to show, because really the only downside is kind of that lingering Mars square, as well as Venus, the moon's lord, being within the beams of the sun. So, but other than that, everything else is really well together, and then you have the stabilizing Jupiter presence in the first house. So it's a really well-constructed chart. Definitely one that I would consider higher up on the list. 2021 is kind of a rough year for Saturn. He's going to be in for a lot. After this election, Saturn kind of goes through hell. On May 23rd, Saturn turns retrograde, so of course we can't use Saturn at all throughout that time period, and the retrograde phase lasts until October 11th. So we're going to go ahead and skip forward several months to October. This is September. We'll move forward to October 11th. And here we have Saturn stationed, direct, and of course, at this point, we're kind of open back up to Saturn talismans, which is great. But on October 31st, just about 20 days later, Saturn gets within orb of the square with Mars. And so again, we can't use Mars. So now we have, from May to November, where Mars is unusable, basically. So then we have the Mars square to deal with, and Mars square is in effect until around November 25th. So we're going to go ahead and move up to around that time period. Mars and Saturn are comfortably separated here. So after we leave the Mars square behind, Saturn kind of gets to be in the clear for a little bit, but unfortunately during this kind of clear skies period, there really aren't any good Saturn talismanic opportunities to be found during like the winter of 21 to 22. The next big thing that happens is Saturn's combustion being within the beams phase of the sun, which starts on January 19th. And kind of we get to the Cazimi period that perfects on February 4th, I'm sorry. Again, this will be another time to, clean any Saturnine talismans that you made, to, clean a Saturnine altar, or, purchase or make a new one or get new Saturn tools. The Cazimi is always going to be good for that, no matter what kind of the electional configurations for that are. This still would not be a good Saturn Cazimi to make a Saturn talisman for, because the moon isn't in a really good configuration for it, but at least it's not spoiled by the Mars square like the one the year before was. And then on February 21st, the sun gets far enough away from Saturn to where he doesn't have to worry about it, and we can make Saturn talismans again. And we actually have the opportunity to do that on March 19th, 2022, this time set for Saturn on the midheaven. So in this election, we have Saturn in Aquarius conjoined the midheaven, which is very good, with the moon in Libra applying the trine. Libra, of course, being the exaltation of Saturn, so a really great sign for the moon to be in when making Saturnine talismans. This also occurs during Saturn's day, and the moon is moving quickly in this chart, which is really great. The lord of the first house is going to be Mercury here in Pisces, which is, of course, his traditional sign of fall and detriment, which is, not great, but at the same time, Mercury will be conjoined Jupiter, which helps out considerably. Mars, this Mars-Venus conjunction is going to be in a trine to the ascendant. I'm really not upset by that. Usually you just want to kind of watch out for the squares and oppositions to malefic planets. So while I would consider the trine to Venus to be more stabilizing, I wouldn't really consider the trine to Mars to be a really important consideration in this. All in all, I think this election chart is pretty well constructed. I think the only really controversial aspect of it, aside from Mercury being in detriment and fall, with the Lord of the First House being in a sign that doesn't do well and isn't really a major consideration of mine, it may be for others. But I think the really kind of big controversial point is going to be the moon's lord. We have the moon in Libra, so her lord Venus is going to be here in Aquarius, conjoin both Mars and Saturn. I do think the Mars conjunction is going to be a little bit iffy, whereas the Saturn conjunction is probably a bit more debatable as so far as if it's a good or a bad, or kind of what its effect are, and even lessened so, not only because Saturn is the target planet that we're after, but also because Venus is applying the conjunction to Saturn from Aquarius. So Saturn receives Venus, which really changes the relationship between these two planets to where Saturn now has to care for Venus. So that'll really change up how that dynamic plays out. But aside from that, and kind of the conversation that could be had around whether or not it's a good influence or a bad influence, or, an unnoteworthy influence, this chart is a very good one. So, as you may have noticed, as the eagle-eyed among you may have noticed, Saturn and Mars are within 10 degrees here in this chart, far enough away for me to consider them not conjoined, but shortly afterwards, we will have Mars getting too close to the conjunction of Saturn to be usable, and that point occurs somewhere around the 23rd of March for me as they get closer within 8 degrees. And so we'll have this conjunction of Mars play out from March 23rd until April 15th, so we can't use Saturn during that period. We'll kind of move forward. But then almost immediately after that, we'll have Mars station retrograde on June 6th. So then we'll go through, basically the entire summer and most of the fall where we won't have Saturn able to be worked with because he will be retrograde. So we're going to go ahead and move through those months, and we'll go ahead and move to our next electional opportunity, which is going to be for November 24th, 2022. This chart here is set for 1:18 p.m. my time, and we'll have, of course, Saturn on the ascendant in Aquarius, with Aquarius rising, Saturn being lord of the first house. We'll have the moon applying this sextile to Saturn in Aquarius, which is really good. You want that moon connection as much as you can get it. The moon's dispositor is going to be Jupiter down here in Pisces, which is really good, and the moon is moving quickly. Kind of a difficult thing that we want to keep in mind is that the moon is pretty freshly new in this chart. She's almost 12 degrees separated from the sun. So this is one of those ones where I'm a little more iffy on. I don't usually like it when the sun and the moon are in the same sign. Kind of on the one hand, you have this like new moon, this kind of like moon bursting with energy coming out, which a lot of people might find uncomfortable. So just kind of something to keep in mind. And at the same time, you'll also have this moon getting closer to the opposition of Mars. So this is one of my kind of least favorite of the charts, but one to talk about because there aren't a whole lot of electional opportunities for Saturn in Aquarius. So, if you need one, if you haven't had one, or, if you miss some, this might be one to get, just because some of like the primary placements are really good, but some of the secondary ones are a little bit more iffy. So, I really wouldn't rank this one very high. I wouldn't really plan for this one unless, you just haven't caught any of the other ones for whatever reason. In which case this could probably be workable. This opposition is still fairly wide, but it's not my favorite. From there, we will have our next and final electional opportunity for Saturn in Aquarius, which occurs on January 4th. And this is going to be a Saturn rising election, kind of something like this. And so, of course, when we're doing these elections, you want Saturn to be, Saturn on the ascendant with Aquarius rising, Saturn being ruler of the first house. It's going to be a Saturn hour. And we'll have the moon in Gemini applying a trine to Saturn, which is really great. This moon-Mars conjunction is a little bit iffy. 10 degrees is pretty wide, so, we have that energy kind of dissipating out, but still a little bit present, especially since they're both separating from one another since Mars is retrograde. Mars is also going to be, of course, very angular, which is something, to consider a little bit. I definitely watch out for those angular planets. Mars being retrograde while being angular might be a bit more of a kind of like erratic energy, a little bit more flammable, we'll say. So something to keep in mind there. And then kind of finally, even though the moon is moving quickly at this point, her dispositor, Mercury, is not doing well at all in this chart, conjoining the 12th house cusp retrograde and getting closer to the sun for combustion. So again, this is one of my, not really favorite elections to share, or this isn't one that I would really invest heavily in as you can. But then after this, unfortunately, we will be out of Saturn in Aquarius electional opportunities because, as you can see, the sun is getting close to the conjunction of Saturn, and we will have the combustion process begin on January 30th until March 6th, 2023. And then literally the day after, the sun gets close, it gets far enough away from Saturn for Saturn to no longer be within the beams. Saturn dips into Pisces and will leave Aquarius for good for 30 years, as his retrograde cycle in the sign of Pisces will not take him back far enough to move back into Aquarius. So all in all, that leaves us with 8 electional opportunities for Saturn in Aquarius. Obviously not a lot, and a lot less that you would expect from a planet that's going to be in the same sign for, the greater part of 3 years. But it's often really difficult to get the configurations for planetary talismans correct, especially when you're working with a planet like Saturn. You need to get the moon to apply to Saturn from some kind of aspect, one of the sextiles or one of the trines or conjunctions. Even squares would be okay generally, but I'm hesitant to really pump up charts that have squares with malefic planets, even if they are the focus planet in the chart, just because of that kind of uneasy, difficult energy being coupled with a planet that is traditionally difficult or uneasy. So while on the surface it sounds really easy and like you have a lot of opportunities for moon sign placements to do Saturn in Aquarius, she could be in Aquarius or Aries or Taurus or Gemini or Libra or Scorpio or Sagittarius. If you take out the squares, well, then you've lost Taurus and Scorpio. But then also you need to consider that Saturn doesn't do very well in the sign of Aries. So having the moon apply to a sextile to Saturn in Aquarius from the sign of Aries is not something I prioritize very highly, and I try to avoid it when I can. You notice none of the elections that I share with you today have the moon in Aries, just because of that refusal relationship. I try to avoid it. So that means that the moon can really only be in Aquarius or Gemini or Libra or Sagittarius, really, to be able to form kind of a more healthy aspect relationship with Saturn. So the moon needs to be in those signs, immediately applying to Saturn while it's Saturn's day or Saturn's hour, while Saturn is also angular, and you kind of see how the time frames start to slip away from you. And then, one of the more difficult parts with working with heavier planets like Saturn and Jupiter, even though they're in their signs for a long period of time, they're retrograde for several month sections during that, so it makes it a little bit more complicated to work with. So the November 24th, 2022 and the January 4th, 2023, they're ones that I prioritize very low on the scale. I don't really like them all that much, especially compared to other ones. And then the earlier elections that we shared, the April 15th, 2020 and the May 4th, 2020 election, there you're going to have to worry about the Mars in the first house, whether that's something that you're going to deal with or not. I would recommend skipping it if at all possible. So then you really only have 4 elections that are really any good. The December 21st, 2020 and the December 26th, 2020 are a little bit more like special elections because of the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction and the heightened significance that has within mundane astrology, and how that's not necessarily a pure Saturnian talisman because you have the Jupiter conjunction there. While on the one hand it can be useful and still utilized, it isn't really a pure Saturn election or a pure Saturn talisman. I'm not saying not use it. I'm not saying not go for it. I think everybody should make one because it's such a rare and interesting configuration. But that really only leaves us with the April 25th, 2021 and the March 19th, 2022 elections as really great looking Saturn talismanic elections. The March 19th one, of course, has that a little bit more controversial configuration with Venus being conjoined Mars and Saturn, with Venus being the Lord of the Moon. So if the Lord of the Moon sign is a placement that you prioritize very highly in your electional opportunities, then you're probably not going to use that chart, which is really going to leave you with the April 25th, 2021, which was, of course, my favorite. I like the March 19th, 2022 one as well. And then I'm really excited about the December 21st, 2021. But the other ones are kind of more meh, and aren't really ones that I would, like I said, invest in very heavily unless you have, for some reason missed one of the really good ones and you want a Saturn in Aquarius talisman. So speaking about Saturn in Aquarius, why somebody would want a talisman for Saturn in Aquarius, that is a little bit more of a personal discussion or a personal decision. What Saturn talismans can do for you. Of course, Saturn is more of a malefic planet, so a lot of his talismanic powers are a bit less, I'll say, sparkly and shiny and desirable. And they tend to be a little bit more mundane or kind of or even a little bit on the malevolent side. So Saturn talismans are not generally utilized heavily for protection unless what you're trying to do is be safe because everybody is afraid of you. They're really great tools for instilling fear. Saturn is a very severe planet and very good at saying no to things. So if you're somebody who struggles with saying no, or getting things off of your plate, if you are a chronic people pleaser, or if you've had issues with establishing and reinforcing boundaries in the past and things that you're comfortable with and uncomfortable with, and making those distinctions known, a Saturn talisman can be a really great way for you to really get that I don't give a fuck attitude and just say no to things that you do not want to do and not feel bad about it. So that's a really great kind of more positive use of a more negative effect of Saturn that I really suggest for anybody who's struggling in those areas. Saturn is also a really good planet when it comes to study and to understand things. And there's a little bit of a contrast here between Mercury and Saturn. They're both very studious planets, but in different ways. Mercury is a little bit more concerned with what I'll call like the earth sciences, with measurement and understanding kind of the clockwork of how things work and why things work, and kind of the dissecting kind of thing. Of course, there are some kind of more conventionally mystical aspects of Mercury significations. Mercury is, of course, related to astrologers and several other forms of divination, but Mercury is more of the how things work, and Saturn is more of the why things work. Saturn is a little bit more concerned with like metaphysical operations. So if you're anybody who is working or interested in those kinds of fields like magic or psychology or occultism, or like even heavier sciences that are kind of exploring their own meanings, like astrophysics or quantum physics, or just kind of anything that is related to almost like a great big theory of everything and how things work or why things work and what the meaning of those things are, Saturn is a really great planet for that. If you're an individual with Capricorn or Aquarius rising, Saturn can be a really great tool to use for your own personal health. Saturn can be a really great tool to use if you're trying to make things last. Saturn signifies old things and kind of the wisdom and experience that comes with that agedness. Saturn is also really great with anybody who is considering or already has a practice that focuses on the spirits of the deceased, whether through like ancestral worship or through mediumship or any kind of other form of necromancy. Basically, Saturn is really good at being that kind of bridge between the physical world and the land of the dead. There are a lot of other applications for Saturn talismans, whether you're just somebody who wants a Saturn talisman to kind of complete a planetary set like me, or if you want to utilize some of the more kind of secondary, tertiary powers of Saturn insofar as like agricultural concerns or mining or the preservations of buildings or things like that. Saturn will be good for any of that. So hopefully this video has helped kind of shed some light on the electional process, kind of what you look for, what time periods you just kind of avoid and ignore and act like they don't exist as well as you can. Of course, all of these electional opportunities will appear again in the Astrological Magical video series when it gets closer to time to those moon phases that those electional charts will occur in. So stay tuned for those. Of course, I might find an electional opportunity that I missed this time, or have different thoughts about one of the elections that I share with you today as we get into the future and closer to time to those. I hope everybody has a really great experience with Saturn in Aquarius and really takes this time to create a good solid practice with Saturn and Saturn magic, because after Saturn leaves Aquarius, we won't have, Saturn in a good sign to do Saturnine talismans with until he gets back into Libra in 2039. So a little bit of a wait there. I'm really excited to see everybody's Saturn in Aquarius altars or talismans or workings and just hear the stories about what happened there. And I want to give a special shout out to everybody whose Saturn is in Aquarius natally. Good luck and hang in there, and I will see everybody again on the Taurus new moon.